The bouquet hit the floor before anyone understood what was happening. One moment the room was warm and full and moving the way wedding receptions move. The soft clink of glasses, the low hum of a string quartet, the particular brightness of 200 people who believe they are watching something permanent begin. And then the bride looked up, saw me standing near the entrance, and the white roses she had been carrying simply fell from her hands. I watched them scatter across the polished hardwood floor. I watched her face go through 4 separate expressions in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked from across a crowded ballroom in Wilmington, North Carolina, like the specific shock of a person whose 2 separate worlds have just collided without warning. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one yet has the language for. Forks stopped. Conversations ended mid-sentence. And the man standing beside the bride, the man who had once promised to marry me, turned slowly toward the door and went the color of old chalk. My name is Claire Donovan. I am 37 years old. I have served as a logistics officer in the United States Marine Corps for 14 years. I grew up in Kinston, North Carolina, in a house where the front porch light was always on and dinner was always at 6 and my father's handshake was the most reliable thing in my world. I joined the Marines at 22 because I wanted to build something with my life that I could be certain of. I found out later that certainty is not something the world gives you. It is something you have to keep earning. I did not come to that ballroom looking for a scene. I did not come for confrontation or performance or any of the satisfying outcomes that revenge stories are supposed to deliver. I came because a woman I had pulled from a burning transport vehicle in the desert was standing at an altar in my hometown with a man who had broken my heart the night before our wedding. And she deserved to know that before she signed her name to anything permanent. But to explain how I got to that doorway I have to go back. Back to before the ballroom and the scattered roses and the silence. Back to a Thursday evening 14 months earlier, when the phone rang at 10:43 and a man I had trusted with my entire future told me, in a voice that was already decided, that he couldn't go through with it. His name was Andrew Calloway. He was 39 years old, a civil engineer who had grown up in Wilmington with the easy confidence of someone whose life had always moved in the direction they pointed it. We had met 4 years earlier at a mutual friend's dinner party. He had been sitting at the far end of the table arguing good-naturedly about baseball, and I had found myself listening to him for 20 minutes before I realized I had stopped paying attention to my own conversation. We dated carefully. I had deployed twice during those 4 years, once to Bahrain, once to Kuwait, and Andrew had handled the distance with what I believed was genuine steadiness. He wrote emails that were long and specific. He sent packages that arrived at the strangest times in the strangest places and always contained something I hadn't asked for but needed. My mother, who was not easy to impress, approved of him within the first 6 months. My father, who was even harder, shook his hand at the engagement dinner and said, "Take care of my daughter." Andrew had looked him in the eye and said he would. That was 14 months before the ballroom. On the Thursday evening it ended, I was sitting at the small desk in my apartment in Jacksonville, reviewing supply reports I had brought home from base. The rehearsal dinner had been 3 hours earlier. Our families had filled the restaurant. My college roommate had given a toast that made everyone laugh. Andrew had squeezed my hand under the table every time someone said something that embarrassed him, which was often. By the time I drove home, the wedding felt as real and solid as anything I had ever built. Then the phone rang. He didn't say hello. There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to understand something was wrong before he said a single word. Then he exhaled, the long, slow exhale of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply managing the delivery. "Claire." His voice was careful. "We need to talk." My stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" Another pause. "I can't go through with the wedding tomorrow." For a moment I genuinely thought I had misheard him. I set down the report I was holding. "Andrew. It's not nerves," he said quickly, like he had anticipated that response. "It's my parents." That sentence landed with a weight he probably didn't intend. Andrew's parents, Robert and Diane Calloway, had always been polite to me. But polite is not the same as warm, and warm is not the same as accepting. Robert Calloway had built a successful commercial real estate firm across the Cape Fear region. Diane sat on 3 nonprofit boards and had the particular manner of a woman who had spent 40 years deciding which people belonged in which rooms. They had been civil to me at every dinner, every holiday gathering, every occasion where civility was the minimum expected. But I had always felt in those rooms like someone whose file was still under review. What about your parents? I said carefully. Andrew cleared his throat. They introduced me to someone. I heard the sentence. I understood the sentence. I sat very still on the edge of my desk chair and let it reach me at whatever pace it needed. Someone, I repeated. A woman. Her family's from Charlotte. Her father runs a logistics company. They think, his voice dropped slightly, they think she would be a better fit for where I'm headed. I stared at the blank wall across from my desk. The wedding dress was hanging on the back of my closet door in the next room. I had tried it on 3 times that week for no reason except that it made the future feel close enough to touch. Are you canceling our wedding? I said slowly. Because your parents found someone wealthier. It's more complicated than that. I want you to answer the question, Andrew. His voice was almost a whisper. Yes. One word. For years. One word to fold it all up and put it away. I didn't yell. I had been trained in environments where yelling is a luxury you cannot afford, where the situation demands that you stay functional regardless of what you are feeling. I will need you to make the calls tonight, I said. Before people start arriving tomorrow. Yes. Of course. I'm sorry, Claire. Apologies after betrayal have a particular sound. They are sincere and useless in equal measure. I know, I said. Then I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that. Outside, Jacksonville moved through its Thursday night the way it always did. Traffic, distant voices, the sound of the bass in the background, steady and indifferent. I looked at the wall for a while. Then I got up, walked to the closet, and without turning the light on, I took the wedding dress off the hook and folded it into the garment bag and put it on the shelf. That took approximately 4 minutes. Then I sat back down and called my mother. She arrived 45 minutes later with my father behind her. They did not say much. My father sat in the chair across from me with his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was controlling something he would rather not control. My mother sat beside me on the couch and held my hand. Around midnight I heard a gentle knock at the door. It was my neighbor from across the hall, a woman named Mrs. Elaine Forsyth, 71 years old and a widow who had lived in that building for 12 years and knew the sound of every apartment's troubles through the walls. She had brought a plate of food and a pot of chamomile tea and she didn't ask any questions. She simply set them on the counter and sat down near my mother and stayed. That was the night the first version of this story ended. The second version began 3 weeks later when I boarded a military transport to Kuwait. I want to be honest about those first months because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean one. I was not immediately fine. I was not the kind of person who sheds grief quickly and moves forward without looking back. I carried the weight of what had happened the way you carry weight in the field. Because there is no alternative, because the mission continues regardless, because other people depend on your ability to function. But I carried it. My unit was stationed at a forward logistics base outside Kuwait City, supporting marine operations throughout the region. The work was demanding in the way that saved me, constant, specific, requiring a precision that left very little room for anything else. Supply coordination, fuel allocations, convoy planning, equipment manifests that needed to be right because the consequences of getting them wrong were real. I arrived in country in February. By April, I had stopped replaying the phone call every night before I fell asleep. By June, I had almost stopped replaying it at all. Almost. Late in the summer, a new transport unit rotated into the base. Among the Marines who arrived was a corporal named Sloane Whitfield. She was 25 from a small town in Georgia, with the kind of focused energy that made you want to give her responsibility just to see how she handled it. She was assigned to a transportation company that coordinated regularly with my logistics office. And the first time she came to my door she was holding a stack of convoy manifests and had already identified the error in them before she knocked. "Ma'am," she said, "I think there's a problem with these escort assignments." He was right. 2 trucks had been listed under the wrong unit. A small mistake that would have caused significant confusion once the convoy was on the road. "Good catch, Corporal," I said. She allowed herself a small smile and took the corrected forms and left. That was the beginning. Over the following months, Sloane Whitfield became one of those Marines you simply trust. She worked hard without broadcasting it. She made decisions carefully and stood behind them afterward. She asked questions that revealed she was thinking 3 steps ahead. I began relying on her judgment in ways that went beyond her rank, which is the highest compliment a logistics officer can offer anyone in the field. The afternoon everything changed was in late August. The heat that week had been the kind that presses down on you like a physical weight. A supply convoy had returned from a long route and several vehicles were lined up in the maintenance yard for inspection before being cleared for the next run. I was in my office reviewing fuel allocation reports when the alarm went off. Anyone who has been on a military base knows that alarm. Your body knows what it means before your brain finishes processing the sound. I stepped outside immediately. Dark smoke was rising from the far end of the vehicle inspection area. Someone was shouting, "Truck fire." I crossed the yard at a run. The vehicle, a heavy transport, had developed a fuel line rupture during inspection. Diesel had reached a hot surface and the fire had spread fast along the underside of the chassis. Marines were approaching with extinguishers. And then I heard, beneath the shouting and the alarm and the hiss of the extinguishers, a single voice that made everything else in the scene rearrange itself. "Someone's inside." Corporal Whitfield had been checking the cab's dashboard systems when the fire started. The driver's side door had warped from the heat and wouldn't open. Through the smoke and the cracked windshield I could see her, conscious, moving, trying to kick the door open with both feet while smoke filled the cab around her. The Marines at the door were trying to pry it with a bar. The metal wouldn't give. I looked at the fire. Diesel burns unpredictably. If the fuel tank heated past the threshold, the calculation changed immediately and permanently. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the nearest maintenance cart and ran toward the cab. "Move," I told the Marines at the door. They stepped back. I swung the wrench at the side window. Once. Twice. The glass shattered inward. Smoke poured out. "Corporal Whitfield," I said clearly, "climb out now." She was coughing, disoriented, but she heard me. She turned toward the window. I reached through the frame and grabbed her arm and pulled. She got halfway through the opening. Another Marine grabbed her from the other side. We pulled her clear and moved fast and got 20 yards away before the fire crew finally suppressed the flames. Sloane lay on the ground on her back, coughing hard, her face covered in soot, her eyes wide and unfocused. Then her eyes found mine. "Ma'am," she said. Her voice was thin. "You came in there." "That's what Marines do," I said. She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "You saved my life." She was treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. Within 3 weeks she was back on duty. But something had shifted between us. She stopped by my office more often than protocol required. She asked questions that had nothing to do with convoy manifest. One evening, sitting outside after the heat had broken, she said something I remember clearly. "You know what I realized?" "What's that?" I said. "That courage isn't loud." She looked at the sky. "It just shows up when it's needed." I didn't respond. But I thought about it for a long time afterward. The deployment ended 11 months after it began. I flew home on a Tuesday in January. Kinston was the same as it always was. The same streets, the same church steeple, the same feel of a town that has decided on its particular pace and intends to maintain it. My parents picked me up at the airport. My mother had made my favorite meal. My father carried my bag without being asked. That first week home was the gentle disorientation of return. Everything familiar and slightly out of scale, the way your childhood bedroom looks smaller every time you come back to it. A week after I returned, I ran into an old friend at the farmer's market downtown. We talked for a few minutes about nothing particular. Then she mentioned, almost as an aside, the way people mention things in small towns when they want to make sure you know. "Did you hear about Andrew Calloway? He's getting married next month." I smiled appropriately. "Wilmington girl? Charlotte, I think. Her last name's Whitfield or something like that. She moved here a few months ago." The name arrived quietly. Then it began to work on me slowly, the way certain things do. Not loudly, not immediately, just steadily, until I was home that evening sitting on the porch in the cold with a cup of coffee, and the name had rearranged itself into something I needed to look at directly. Sloane Whitfield. I told myself it was a common name. I told myself the odds were absurd. I took my laptop to the kitchen table and opened the browser. Small towns post-wedding announcements. It took less than 3 minutes to find it. Andrew Calloway and Sloane Whitfield. The photograph beneath the announcement showed Andrew in a dark suit. And beside him, smiling at the camera, was the Marine I had pulled from a burning vehicle in Kuwait. For a long time I sat looking at the screen. Not angry. Not even particularly shocked, because the part of me that processes strange information had already begun processing this the moment my friend said the name at the farmer's market. Just thoughtful. And underneath the thoughtfulness, something that felt like the final weight of a decision I had been approaching for 11 months without quite arriving at it. I closed the laptop. I picked up my coffee. I went to find Mrs. Forsyth. She had moved back to Kinston after her daughter relocated here, and she lived now in a small house on the east side of town with a porch that caught the afternoon sun perfectly. I knocked on her door that evening and she opened it without surprise, the way women of a certain wisdom open doors, as if they have been expecting you for a while. "Come sit down," she said. I sat at her kitchen table for the second time in 14 months and told her everything. She listened the way she always listened, without hurrying me, without performing sympathy, just present and attentive in the way that is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to the wedding?" "No one invited me," I said. "That wasn't what I asked." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the particular patience of someone who knows the answer you haven't said yet. "I don't know," I said honestly. She picked up her tea. "The thing about unfinished business," she said, "is that it doesn't actually finish by itself. You already know that, or you wouldn't be sitting at my table tonight." She set the cup down. "The question isn't whether you're angry. The question is whether that young woman deserves to know the truth before she promises herself to a man who has already proven what he'll do when something more convenient appears." I sat with that for a long time. Then I drove home and stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes and chose the simplest dress I owned, dark blue, nothing that announced itself, and I set it on the chair for Saturday and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. But by morning I was certain. The Whitmore estate in Wilmington had been converted to a wedding and event venue 3 years earlier. It sat on a long flat property south of the historic district, a white colonial house with wide porches and an interior ballroom that had been restored to its original proportions. High ceilings, wide plank floors, tall windows looking out onto the grounds. I had driven past it before without particular interest. That Saturday evening I pulled into the parking lot as the sun was finishing its descent and sat in my car for a while with the engine off. Through the lit windows I could see movement. Music floated out through the open side doors, something soft and string-based. I took a breath. Then I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The ballroom was exactly what I expected. Warm and full and carefully arranged, with the beautiful temporary quality of occasions that have been planned for a long time. Flowers on every table. White candles burning. 200 people in their good clothes holding drinks, doing the particular performance of happiness that wedding receptions call for. I stood near the entrance for a moment and looked for Andrew. I found him near the center of the room. He was standing with a small group of men, his jacket slightly loosened, his posture relaxed. He looked well. Then from across the room he looked up. Our eyes met. His expression went through several things quickly. Recognition. Something close to fear. And then, before either of us could react further, the music shifted and someone near the front of the room announced that the bride was entering. Everyone turned toward the doors. And Sloane Whitfield walked in. She wore ivory, simple and clean, with her dark hair pulled back in the way it always was on base. She carried white roses. She walked forward with the posture of someone who had been trained to move through difficult terrain without showing the difficulty. She looked beautiful in the specific way of someone who doesn't require an occasion to be impressive. They simply are, and the occasion has found them. She smiled at the guests as she passed each table. She squeezed an older woman's hand. And then, moving toward the center of the room, her eyes swept the space the way trained eyes always sweep spaces. Methodically, completely, and they landed on me. The bouquet hit the floor before the recognition had fully finished crossing her face. The silence was immediate and total. 200 people who had been in the middle of something stopped. Sloane's hand was still extended at the height where the bouquet had been. Her eyes were fixed on me. Her lips had parted slightly. Then she said it, not quietly, not privately, but in the clear, carrying voice of someone who has spent years making themselves heard over noise and distance and the general chaos of difficult situations. "Oh my God." The words went through the room. "She's my commanding officer." Andrew's face, from across the ballroom, was the color of the white tablecloths. He didn't move. No one moved. Sloane walked toward me. The crowd parted for her automatically, the way crowds part for people who move with purpose. She stopped 3 feet in front of me. "Ma'am." Her voice had changed. The wedding reception brightness had gone out of it and something older and more serious had come in. "Yes, Corporal," I said. The title landed in the room like a key in a lock. The murmuring that had begun when she crossed the floor went up in volume and then as she reached me went down again. For a moment she just looked at me. Then she wrapped her arms around me the way she had that afternoon in Kuwait when I pulled her from the cab and the fire crew moved in and the immediate danger passed and she had finally understood that she was going to survive it. Tight. Without ceremony. Her shoulders shook slightly. "You're here," she said quietly. "Yes," I said. "How long have you known?" "I found out 3 days ago." She stepped back and looked at my face carefully. The Marine in her was reading me the way Marines read each other. Quickly and accurately. "You came to tell me." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Then she turned and faced the room. Her voice was steady. The steadiness cost her something, I could see that, but she paid it without hesitation. "I need everyone to understand something," she said clearly. "This woman saved my life last summer." The room stirred. She pulled me from a burning vehicle on a military base in Kuwait. If she hadn't broken the window and reached in and dragged me out, I wouldn't be standing here tonight. More murmuring, louder now. She looked at Andrew. Then she asked him, in front of 200 people, the question that had been sitting in the room since the moment I walked through the door. "Did you know her?" He said nothing. She asked again. "Did you know Claire Donovan before we met?" Andrew's father, a heavy-set man in a gray suit near the head table, started to stand. His mother touched his arm. Andrew looked at the floor. "Emily," he started. "Sloan," she said quietly. "My name is Sloan." He looked up. "Yes." He said it in a single syllable that cost him visibly. "We were engaged." The room absorbed that. Sloan turned the information over carefully, the way you turn an object in your hands when you're trying to understand its shape. "When did it end?" "The night before the wedding." More murmuring. Someone near the back said something I couldn't hear. Sloan looked at me again. "You were the one who cancelled?" "No," I said. "He was." More silence. Andrew's mother, Diane Calloway, stood and crossed the floor with the contained urgency of someone who has been managing situations for 40 years. "Emily," she said. Sloan repeated without turning. Diane stopped beside her. "Whatever history exists between these people," she said carefully, "tonight is not the occasion to, with respect, Mrs. Calloway," Sloan said, "tonight is the only occasion that matters." She looked at the older woman directly. "When you introduced me to your son, you told me his last relationship ended because of incompatible lifestyles." Diane's expression didn't change. "I believe that was an honest description." Sloan nodded. "It wasn't." Diane folded her hands. "These things are complicated." Sloan looked at Andrew's father, who had remained seated. "Did you know Claire Donovan when you introduced your son to me?" Robert Calloway shifted. "We knew of her. And you decided she wasn't the right fit." He didn't answer. "She was a Marine officer from a working-class family," Sloan said evenly. "And my father runs a logistics company. That's a more useful kind of connection." Robert's face tightened. "We wanted what was best for our son." Sloan looked at him for a long moment. "And what was best for your son was replacing a woman he had promised to marry with someone whose family had more professional leverage." No one spoke. Sloan turned back to Andrew. She studied him for a moment with the particular attention of someone who is seeing something clearly for the first time, not because the thing has changed but because the light has shifted. "Andrew," she said. He raised his eyes. "You told me you admired my independence." "Yes." "My career." "Yes." "The fact that I didn't need anyone to define my direction." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did it occur to you that you admired those things in me because you had already failed to honor them in her?" The question moved through the room like something physical. Andrew's jaw tightened. "Emily," Sloan. "I can't keep having this conversation the same way." He ran his hand through his hair. "I was in a different place then." She nodded slowly. "No." He looked at her. "Now I'm here with you." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Ma'am." "Yes." "Did you come here tonight to end this?" "I thought about that honestly." "No," I said. He waited. "I came because you deserved to have the whole picture before you made a permanent decision. Not because you owe me anything. Not because I wanted to take anything from you. Just because the truth existed and you didn't have it." Sloan was quiet for a moment. The room was so still that the candles flickered in the absence of sound. Then she picked up one of the fallen roses from the floor near her feet and turned it slowly in her hands. "Andrew," she said. He looked at her. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she set the rose back down on the nearest table with a care that said everything about what came next. "Can," she said. His voice was barely a sound. "Emily," Sloan. She said it one last time, Not with anger but with the finality of someone who has decided and will not be argued back. My name is Sloane. And I can't build a marriage on a foundation I've just watched shift. She looked at the room, at the guests, at the flowers, at the small jazz trio standing silent beside their instruments. I'm sorry, she said clearly. I know many of you came from far away. I know this isn't what anyone expected tonight. She paused. It isn't what I expected either. But I learned something this year from a woman who ran toward a burning vehicle without being asked and reached in without knowing if she'd be able to pull anyone out. She looked at me. And what I learned is that doing the right thing doesn't wait for a convenient moment. It arrives when it arrives. And you either act or you don't. She turned back to Andrew one last time. I wish you well. Honestly. She said it without bitterness. Then she walked toward me and took my arm gently and said quietly, "Walk with me." We went out through the side doors onto the wide porch. The January air was cold and the grounds beyond the porch were dark and the sound of the ballroom behind us diminished quickly. Sloane stood at the railing and looked out at the lawn for a while. She was still holding one of the white roses. Finally she said, "How are you?" "Honestly? Yes." I smiled slightly. "Better than I expected to be standing on this particular porch." She laughed. One short sound. Then she looked at me sideways. "I had no idea." "I know." She shook her head slowly. When he talked about his past relationship he made it sound like it had just run its course. I had no reason to question that. "That's not your fault," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "When did you figure it out?" 3 days ago." She turned to look at me. "And you still came tonight?" "Yes." "Why?" I looked out at the dark lawn. "Because I spent 11 months in Kuwait learning that the difference between the right thing and the easy thing is usually the distance between them." She nodded. "And you were willing to make that walk?" "Yes." She was quiet for a while. Then, "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" "I already have," I said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "I'm not saying it for him. I said it for me." He thought about that. Behind us, through the closed doors, we could hear the sound of the ballroom beginning to empty. Chairs being moved. Voices becoming separate as the crowd dispersed. All of that arrangement dissolving back into ordinary life. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you forgive something like that and mean it?" I thought about the question seriously. "Because holding on to it means carrying it," I said finally. "And I have other things I need my hands for." Sloane looked at the rose in her hand. Then she set it carefully on the porch railing. The cold air moved through the grounds below us. She said, "I'm going to put in for a transfer. Fort Pendleton. I'd like to keep moving forward." "That sounds right," I said. She nodded. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said something I did not expect. "Thank you. For Kuwait. For tonight. For both." I looked at her. "You would have done the same." She shook her head slightly. "I don't know that yet." She looked at me. "But I'm going to spend the rest of my career finding out." We stood on the porch until the cold made it impractical. Then we went back inside and said the quiet necessary goodbyes and I drove home through Wilmington's winter streets toward Kinston. The heater ran. The radio played something low. The highway stretched out ahead in the dark. I thought about Andrew standing in that ballroom watching something he had built collapse in real time. I felt the specific absence of satisfaction that comes when you have expected to feel satisfied and don't, which is itself a kind of answer. Because I hadn't come for satisfaction. I had come for what Sloane deserved. And somewhere between the parking lot and the porch, I had gotten something I hadn't planned on. The clean sensation of having nothing left unresolved. Nothing left sitting in a room waiting to be addressed. The past had been looked at directly and had found its appropriate size. Which is small. Which is always, eventually, small. 6 weeks later I was back at Camp Lejeune running a supply coordination exercise for a group of junior Marines when I received a letter in the interoffice mail. The handwriting on the envelope was immediately recognizable, precise and upright. The handwriting of someone who had been trained to write clearly under difficult conditions. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that my transfer came through. I report to Camp Pendleton in 3 weeks. I also wanted to say something I didn't say well enough on the porch that night. What you did in Kuwait was the kind of thing I think about when I'm trying to decide what kind of Marine I want to be. And what you did in Wilmington was the kind of thing I think about when I'm trying to decide what kind of person I want to be. I hope our paths cross again under quieter circumstances. Respectfully, Corporal Sloane Whitfield." I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. A month after that I received a second letter. This one from Andrew. It was longer and more careful and said the things that apology letters say when they are sincere, which this one was. He had been doing some thinking. He had made choices that prioritized the path of least resistance over the person in front of him. He understood now that those were the same choice. He wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know that he understood what he had done and that he was sorry in a way that had taken him a while to arrive at. I read it twice. Then I wrote back 2 sentences. I accept your apology. I hope you learn what you said you learned. And that was the last correspondence. These days I sometimes tell younger Marines when the conversation goes in that direction, that the moment that looks like revenge from the outside is almost never actually revenge from the inside. What it usually is, if you're lucky and you've done enough of the work, is the quiet closing of a door that has been standing open for too long. I tell them that forgiveness is not a feeling that arrives. It is a decision you make, sometimes more than once, until it becomes the truth. And I tell them that the people who hurt you are not always the whole story. Sometimes the woman who marries the man who broke your heart turns out to be the bravest person in the room. And sometimes the room you walked into looking for one kind of ending gives you something you weren't expecting. Something better. Something that asks nothing of you except that you were honest enough to show up. If this story reminded you of a moment when doing the right thing was the harder thing, share it with someone who needs to hear that tonight. And if you enjoy stories about the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself until it's needed, come back. Because there are more of them. And they are all still being lived.